Hello, Houston. Continue our journey here through long-term memory. Last time we had reached the point where we were talking about different types or 4 different types of distinctiveness, and in essence I had already talked about one of the 4, and that is primary distinctiveness. The example that I gave you there was a list of fruits where one of them was printed in words or letters that were much bigger than the others that constituted the list, and the result was that that one just had a physical feature about it that was so obviously identifiable that when I then asked people to recall the list, that one is the one that jumps out at you. And even though it was buried right down in the middle of the list, given the serial position effect, that was the one that people often tended to recall first. So in essence, what's demonstrated there is just one of the ways in which items can be made distinguishable from one another, and to a certain extent that aids in recall. So if they're physically different, that's one way in which items can be made more simple. You'll remember we reviewed a study by Watkins et al. In the last tape that involved emphasizing or stressing the importance of the last 4 words. And to emphasize that, what they did was to print those 4 words in a list of 12 or so in block letters to make them really stand out. That's an example of using primary distinctiveness. Secondary distinctiveness is another way that we can make words stand out. Secondary distinctiveness is essentially defined as the ability to differentiate the subject item from others in long-term storage. Now that may or may not seem uniquely different from primary distinctiveness, but in essence there are several different ways to illustrate the difference in what I'm talking about there. That is, when we start looking at secondary kinds of features that nonetheless make items distinct, we include things like what are called orthographic distinctiveness. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Words like this: khaki, syzygy, syrphid, and tithe are examples of words that have an unusual combination of letters. My favorite there, I think we talked about last time, is syzygy, where there are 3 Y's in the word, and that just graphically makes that word stand out, simply because it's unlike almost any other word in the English language. It has, maybe we can use thy as another example, but that's one of very few words that doesn't have any A, E, I, O, or U in it, and that basically leads then to orthographic distinctiveness. You compare those words to words like which, or orange, or sparrow, and those are very common, things that we would see all the time, and they're not unique in terms of the way that the structure of the word is actually put together there. So they are unusual, as we were playing with that word last time. There are basically 2 ways, if you look at words like khaki and syzygy and syrphid and tithe, 2 ways to remove that effect or minimize it. One is to use all capitals. That is, by using lowercase, where we have the ability to go above line or below line, that tends to make the difference in those words, the distinctiveness of them, jump out at you. One way to reduce that effect is to use all capital letters. That will minimize it. And then the other thing is to present the stimuli verbally rather than visually, as we've done on screen here. So that if I say to you something like khaki, well, yeah, that's just a type of pants or a material that pants are made of, but it doesn't occur to you that there's a double K in that word, and a KH, which is another very unusual combination. So in essence, by either using all caps or presenting it verbally, the orthographic distinctiveness of the words tends to, as the words are about to, disappear. There's another way that we can also make words secondarily distinctive, and that is to engage in what's called onomatopoeia. That is essentially where the word, whoops, I actually went to that before I meant to. In onomatopoeia, what we're dealing with there is a word that sounds like that to which it refers. And there you get into some very interesting multilingual comparisons, because, for instance, a word like buzz does kind of capture the sound or the essence of the sound that it's talking to. The zzz is kind of like what a door buzzer does when it's sounding. Crack, under certain conditions, the k in that word can also depict what we're talking about when we crack something. Cuckoo, to a certain extent mimics what a bird coming out of a clock is saying. Even whir and the in that word may in fact reflect something that a fan does under certain conditions. But then you get to a word that cross-culturally is rather interesting, meow. You and I know immediately what animal I'm talking about and what sound we're dealing with when I talk about meow. But the interesting thing is that other languages use different words. I don't, but does anybody in the room speak Spanish? And what is the word for what a cat says in Spanish? Anybody familiar with that? Well, a lost opportunity, I guess. But when you compare across languages, the words that are used to identify meow and bark, or woof, which is the one that's more often used when you're mimicking a dog, they tend to differ substantially. So it's an argument essentially as to whether whether a word like meow really does represent onomatopoeia or not, because yeah, in one sense you might think of that as M-E-O-W, but in another sense the pitch at which it's done is quite different from the word that you and I tend to use to describe it. Okay, third type of distinctiveness involves what is called emotional distinctiveness. And here what we're going to do is to define that essentially as terms which produce intense motivational reactions. Okay? Any term which produces intense motivational reactions. Okay? If you had a word like Negro in a list of other nouns, that is a word that tends to have a lot of emotional affect associated with it, or a lot of affect associated with it, and in a derogatory use of that, it has even stirred up city council meetings in a suburb of Houston just within the last several months in early 2007. So that is a word, just one example of a word that has emotional distinctiveness just because of its history and the history of its use in particular. So in essence, that's a term that can produce very intense motivational reactions, and in turn, what that does then is to make that a word that will stand out in a list of other similar nouns. Other examples. Okay, something like a flashbulb memory is an example of a word that has a great deal or an event that has a great deal of excess emotion attached to it. And so we define it essentially, flashbulb memory basically illustrates retention of events that are based partly on your own or the learner's emotional state when the event which is now remembered originally occurred. Okay? Retention based partly on the emotion stirred by an event. Ask anyone who's my age, mid-60s, and who was at least a high school student in 1963, where they were, who they were with, and what they were doing when they learned that President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. And you will get an answer. In every instance, that's an event that's now 45 years old, but in the memory of those that are now in their 60s or even 70s, they can tell you where they were, what they were doing, and who they were with, because that in our lives has become essentially a flashbulb memory. It's just one example of the type of event which can have a very significant impact on its ability to be retrieved out of long-term storage. So for me, across the entirety of my life, you and I, given your age and mine, have shared some very significant events since. The Challenger disaster, for some, interestingly enough, is now beginning to fade a little bit. The students now in my classes, now that we're 5 or 6 years past that event, are more likely to cite the 9/11 tragedy as the key example of a flashbulb memory. But 9/11 or 9/11 is most frequently cited nowadays as an example of a flashbulb memory. Again, there was a great deal of emotion attached to that, and certainly I remember it also. But when somebody asks me for an example of flashbulb memory, the first one I always give is the JFK assassination. Partly because, and we've talked about this a little bit before, the cohort effect, that each of us lives an entire 60, 65, 70, 75-year life, but the events that occurred during that life differ for each of us. And so in essence, JFK occurred when I was in graduate school. His assassination occurred when I was in graduate school. And the 9/11 tragedy certainly is major in its impact in the lives of all of us. But in the totality of my life, 9/11 is going to have lesser of an impact than it will in yours. I mean, you and I practically have to disrobe now when we get on a plane anywhere to prove that we're not carrying anything dangerous. And yes, I'll have to do that for another 15 years or so, average time of death. You're going to have to do it for 50 or 55 years unless they figure out some way to examine us all electronically. It doesn't involve, as it does now, taking off anything metallic in our shoes and everything else. So in one sense, 9/11 will ultimately have a bigger impact in your lives simply because it occurred earlier in the chronology of your entire life. And so to a certain extent, what it is that dictates what becomes a flashbulb memory is partly a function of how old we are when it occurs, what the surrounding circumstances were, and so forth. There's another factor related to this that has generated some rather interesting research, and that is what's called mood congruence. This is a little bit of a slippery slope in terms of trying to track this down or tack this down in a way that makes it studyable. But if we look at mood congruence, what we're talking about is the positive impact of similarity of emotional state with the material to be learned, which is a lot of words, but basically what it's saying is that to the extent that whatever it is that you're trying to learn is related to the mood that you're in when the material is learned, essentially aids in the recall of that information or may aid in the retention of it and the later retrieval of it at some later time in your life. Blaney studied mood in two different ways. In one situation, what he did was to study people whose moods differ, okay? And the kind of question that he was asking in that study was essentially, are those who are perpetually depressed better or worse at recalling depressing things? Okay, are people who are permanently or largely depressed, are they better at recalling past events in their lives that are depressing than are the rest of us that are more average in terms of our optimism, pessimism? And the answer is definitely they're better. People who are depressed tend to remember depressing things in their lives better than those of us who are not immediately and obviously depressed. And then the second thing that Blaney did was to manipulate moods and then check for recall, which leads to some rather interesting research. For instance, people who are happy tend to recall more happy things, kind of the corollary of what we were talking about a minute ago. But you even notice that when you go into a restaurant with friends, think about what you tend to talk about, among other things, at that meal. Is it not the case that you often find yourself talking about other restaurants? When you're sitting at a restaurant, it gets embarrassing sometimes. The waiter or waitress is coming up to you and your friends are sitting there talking about how good the food is at some other restaurant. But in essence, there's a case where your mood, you're thinking food, you're in a hunger mood, and those are the memories that tend to crop up. And those memories that crop up then involve, for instance, other good meals that you've had, or maybe you end up talking about recipes of good dishes that your mom makes or you make or something like that. And in essence, what's happening there is that the mood that you're in related to eating and the camaraderie of friendship and so forth calls to mind other things that also involve that camaraderie, good food, and so forth. When my now 17-year-old was 8, 9, and 10, and you could a little better control his state by just talking to him, if he was angry, if he was mad, as happens to all of us at one time or another, every now and then he would get up with a chip on his shoulder, and I would take about 3 minutes of that grief when I was responsible for his care, and then I would basically walk into his room if it was clear he was going to have a bad day, and say to him simply, smile. And I'd get this kind of, not having a good day, can't find my socks, and so forth. And I would just simply insist. I would stand there and wait until he could put a smile on his face. And it would be kind of forced initially. The corners would begin to go up just a little bit, grudgingly, because, of course, here was the old man saying to do something, and the initial reaction is, no. But then, and then pretty soon you go, okay, I can't see your teeth. And then you've got him sitting there smiling. Get him to do that for about a minute or a minute and a half, and the mood evaporates. In essence, he's then able to have a much better day. So in that case, we're essentially using the mood to force the kind of recall that we want him to have, which is happy memories, how to behave like a decent person, a good person, and a happy person. And it works in that way. I'll show you some other examples of it here a little bit later. But that was one that was particularly memorable in the growing up of my now 17-year-old. Another thing that is related to this is what's called mood state dependence. And this is a rather complex thing, but what it talks about is the interrelationship between emotional state at the time material is learned and the emotional state when material is to be recalled. And there's some pretty compelling evidence here, yet this is an area that has some heavily conflicted results in it. But Matlin summarizes the work of Ucros, U-C-R-O-S, in her book, noting that there is a moderately positive relationship that exists between the mood that you're in when you learn material and how well that mood impacts your recall of the material if you're able to replicate it later as opposed to not being able to replicate it later. For instance, in the recall of real-life events, suppose you've been mugged or something like that, when you are able to recreate the emotional tone of that event as it occurred, it aids in your ability to recall the relevant information about, the details of who it was that mugged you or what observations you made at the time that may help the police in tracking down that individual. And it's even more likely with adults, where we've had greater experience with moods and the impact of moods on our observation and so forth, that moods' importance is much greater. So that in general, if as an adult, if we have gotten mugged at some point, or if we participate in any kind of a crime, our ability to recall the pertinent details of who it was and what was going on at the time is greater if the interrogator will actually get you to sit mentally and just kind of recreate in your head the experience, the lightness, the darkness, whether you were scared or not, and so forth and so on. Get that in your head first, and then go into the details of trying to recall the situation. And what you're seeing there is essentially mood congruence as an aid to the ability to recall particular kinds of information. Obviously a kind of distinctiveness specifically with emotional tone. And finally then, we have one other, and that is what's called processing distinctiveness. This is essentially a memory code that is created for an event or an item that distinguishes that item from all other memories. In this case now, we are using processing itself to lend uniqueness to the memory, making it easier to retrieve it when we need it and to retain it as long as we wish to. Okay? Have you ever had the situation of going to sleep and remembering all of a sudden as you're falling asleep, oh, darn it, there's either something you forgot to do today or that you have to remember to do in the morning, okay? You're already kind of drifting off. You're in early stage 1. You're still aware of what's going on, but you're not really concerned about it. And all of a sudden this thought occurs to you. What do? You don't want to end up getting up, going out to the kitchen and writing yourself a note and hanging it on the door, because then you're back to, wide awake. You got to start the whole process of going to sleep again all over. What I have found works is to simply roll over to the bed table, the end table, or the bedside table, or lean down on the floor and pick up one of my shoes or a slipper or something and toss it over into another area of the room. Okay, so if I get up in the morning and I've got one shoe here and one is over there somewhere else in the room, that is a cue to me that something I need to remember. Now, in turn, what may happen is that I then waste many minutes of my life as I'm showering trying to remember why on the earth I put that shoe over there. But in every instance when I do that, it will cue the recall that I need, and that's the purpose of it. Simply disrupt my normal morning ritual in some way. So take something that I'm going to have to take with me in the morning, my shoes, a watch, something or other, and put it where it doesn't belong. Visible still, but not where it normally belongs. And in essence, what it does then is it works. It essentially aids you in reminding yourself to do whatever it is that you remembered the night before. Remembering faces is another thing that can be influenced by these kinds of physical alterations, which gives it essentially a processing distinctiveness. Caricatures of famous people are much more easily remembered than actual faces. If you think back to the way in which cartoonists tend to characterize various presidents, They have kind of unique physical characteristics. All of us have them. One of my favorite retentions of that is the caricature that, if you've ever watched the Alfred Hitchcock show, the classic television from 40, 50 years ago now, he used an outline which was basically an outline of a side view of his front. He was fairly portly. And the outline of that very directly reflects, and he would then step into that, and then it would fade from the drawn outline into him as the image. But just seeing that outline with his kind of pot belly was enough to recall, you knew immediately without even listening. If you saw the image, you knew immediately which show you were watching, because it was a caricature of a particular feature of his body. Caricatures of friends are more easily remembered than their actual faces, so that you can assign a name to somebody more rapidly in a reaction time situation if it's a caricature than if it's the actual individual. And so basically what we're doing there is simply we are overemphasizing the features, the physical aspects that make the person memorable in that situation. Ultimately, what this research has yielded is some rather unusual kinds of data. And it's yielded the idea that there are at least 3 different types of memory codes that can be created in this particular situation. One of them is essentially codes that involve physical attributes in some way or another. Structure, as we discussed it earlier. A second code are phonemic codes that can be utilized, where we play on the sound of the word, the actual sound of the word that we are trying to remember. And in other cases, as we'll see, we can actually manipulate the meaning of the words, the terms, the events that we are trying to learn, so that the meaningfulness of the encoded information can make it easier to recall. That last one is easy. If you think about a course that you don't like, sitting down to do homework in that course is deadly. You pick the book up at mid-evening and determine to read 2 hours and 4 chapters because you're behind, and you find yourself snoozing within 30 minutes. The problem is that the material is not meaningful to you. It's not interesting because it has very little meaning. You pick up another book which causes your roommate to go to sleep, and you're thrilled and you can read for hours because in that case it's a course that you are interested in and the meaningfulness is higher. This should remind you significantly, that is the physical, the phonemic, and the semantic cues of the levels of processing model, which makes essentially those same distinctions. We've come at it in a slightly different way here. But some now argue that levels of processing effect can be explained simply in terms of processing distinctiveness. That maybe it's these cues that we're talking about now that really lead to the ability to demonstrate differences in levels of processing under a slightly different code. For instance, we could argue that because of a limited number of phonemes, encoding of semantics is inherently easier because meanings have essentially an infinite number of positions they can take. Infinite number of meanings where we've got 42, 43 phonemes that we can deal with. So to an extent, what might be argued is that the distinctiveness that we're talking about is really the important thing. And the distinctiveness allows us to explain why it is that semantic linkages are much easier for retrieval than are phonemic images, because the phonemes have a limited pool of differences, where semantics, the meaning we attach to things, is essentially infinite. So the challenge that follows is essentially to understand how the structural cues or the physical cues, the phonemic and the semantic factors differ in their distinctiveness and in the elaboration that they facilitate within our head. That becomes essentially the next intellectual challenge here that we're going to go after. So what we're referring to now is essentially what is referred to as encoding specificity. When you and I store information away, how specifically can we store it, and what impact does that have on the ease of us to try to retrieve it? So eyewitnesses to a crime can essentially report significantly more details of a crime, as I said a minute ago, after they've been encouraged to reconstruct the event, the emotions, the situation itself, before they get into the details of what actually happened in that situation. Essentially, forming complex sentences aids in the recall of words that fit within that sentence. So as an example, it does not aid recall for words that don't relate to the sentence itself. The example I can show you on screen is the following, and that is, if we have a sentence like this, okay, the sleepy lion lazily licked the tan cub. That is a very significant aid to recalling a word like cub. If we put it in a testing situation where that's the cue that's given to you and cub is missing, there's a blank line, then in essence, all the other words feed directly into cub being an obvious answer in that situation. But think how dumb it would be if we'd given you a sentence like, the sleepy lion lazily licked the tan swimming. Okay, that's not a word that fits in that situation. I mean, it can obviously be a recall challenge. What is the word? But the link between all the words preceding it and swimming is not at all obvious. In fact, there is none, given the meaning, the semantic difference between those. And so the result is that what's mainly created in that situation is confusion. Now, before we get into the next element, I want to go back and check your memory of information that we talked about in the last tape. Pull out the data that you collected, and if we can get on screen here for a minute, please. Remember, you are not to look at the information on the left side of that sheet, okay? You'll remember in the previous tape, what I did was to read to you a series of words as cues and then ask you to give me the first, the second, or the third association that you had to that cue, okay? And so I gave you a stimulus, and then you wrote down a word. The first thing my word made you think of, the second, or the third. And that was the challenge. And in essence, what I want you to do is to take that paper now, fold it down the middle, okay? Make sure that it is folded down the middle, and get rid of the information. If we can remove my picture from the screen for now, please. In essence, this is what you're left with. That is a sheet that has two different columns of information on it. And what I would like to challenge you to do right now is to use that left column to recall as many of the items in the first column as you can remember without looking at them. Free recall right now. Go for it. Write down as many of the words as you can remember having written down in response to the cues that I gave you in the previous tape. And I'll give you just a minute or so to do that. Based on the number of people who are writing in the room now, let me ask, would 15 more seconds help? Are you going to recall significantly more than you already have? Okay, if we can go back to the image on screen, please. What I want you to do now is to take that sheet of paper, fold it again along the midline of the half that you can still look at, and flip it out of sight. So that now what you end up with is just 1/4 of the page still visible. The other two efforts are now covered. And now what I'd like you to do is to use this column to answer the following. I'm going to reread to you the cues that I gave you at the time. Not telling you what you wrote down, because that's going to be as different as the number of people listening and watching now. But I will reread all of the cues that I gave you at the time, okay, as an aid to recalling the information. Number 1, I asked for your first association to a precious stone. First associate, precious stone. I asked for your second association to a fish. Second associate, fish. I asked for your third association to a state in the United States. To a state in the United States. I asked for your second association to an insect. Second association, insect. I asked for your first association to a type of music. First associate, type of music. I asked for your third association to an alcoholic beverage. Third associate, alcoholic beverage. I asked for your second association to a color. Second associate, color. I asked for your third association to a military title. Third associate, military title. I asked for your first association to an article of clothing. First associate, article of clothing. I asked for your second association to a sport. Second associate, sport. I asked for your first association to a musical instrument. First associate, musical instrument. I asked for your third association to a four-footed animal. Third associate, four-footed animal. I asked for your first association to an occupation. First associate, occupation. I asked for your third association to a weapon. Third associate, weapon. I asked for your second association to an article of furniture. Second associate, article of furniture. I asked for your second association to a type of fuel. Second associate, to a type of fuel. The next one was a disease. I can't remember, was it the first, the second, the third? Oh, now you're telling me which associate I asked you for. Yes, it was the first association to a disease. First association to a disease. I asked for your third association to a vegetable. Third associate, vegetable. I asked for your second association to a type of vehicle. Second associate, type of vehicle. And I asked for your first association to a part of the human body. First associate, part of the human body. Now, you have the answer key in front of you. Open the sheet out and compare the third column to the first one, and also score yourself on the second column. How many did you get right on the second column? To general snickering around the room. How many of you got 5 or less correct on the second column? 5 or less correct. About 40% of the hands go up. How many got 6? 7? 8? 9 or more? Nobody's, one hand went up. How many did you get correct on the second column? How many? 19. Wow. That's impressive. Unusual. How many of you got 20 out of 20 correct on the third column? 1, 2, 3. So about 10% of the hands, sorry, 4. About 15% of the hands went up. 5. About 20% of the hands. Perfect. 20 out of 20. How many of you got 19 out of 20? About the same number of hands go up. How many got 18 out of 20 correct? Okay? Point made. The point here, and it is graphically done here, this was a demonstration originally suggested to me by Gordon Bauer at Stanford. And in essence, what's being demonstrated here is, and we're going to spend the rest of today and part of the next tape demonstrating for you, that it is not that we have necessarily lost the information. What we have lost is the retrieval cue. And when I give you a retrieval cue that is very specific, doesn't tell you at all what the word is to be recalled, but it gives you the general concept and which number of the list that you carry around, the recall is 20 out of 20 correct. I don't know how it is for you at home, but for the people in studio here, it has been 48 hours, 2 days, since we gave them a list of 20 out of 20 words to write down. And here we've got better than half, almost 2/3 of the class with perfect or 90% recall 2 days later on randomly unrelated words. Okay? The point there, and I don't know how to drive it home any more graphically, is that those things we were just talking about, distinctiveness and conditions of learning, are crucial to helping memory operate. If you know precisely what you're reaching for, the information is typically in there. And most of the problem that we suffer in memory, you know, we talk about a lost memory, and I'll show you the primary theories here a little bit later. But in essence, the point is that it's the absence of a retrieval cue, not the absence of that which is to be recalled. Keep that in mind as we look at a variety of other features here. And we're going to go back to the screen now and look at essentially more variations on encoding specificity when they will eventually catch up with me in booth. There we go. I'm going to talk about specifically what is called the encoding specificity principle here. And in essence, this is a two-part principle that really talks about two different things that are going on here. One is the fact that specific encoding operations performed on what is perceived determine what is stored. That is essentially what I've just demonstrated for you. And secondly, what's stored determines what retrieval cues are effective in providing access to what is stored. Okay? So that is the encoding specificity principle, divided into its two major components. Okay? It was proposed originally by Tulving and Thompson back in the early mid-70s. And if we look at that in terms of the various features that we can talk about, I'll go back to the division that I used here a little bit earlier. If we look first of all at physical cues, whereas basically the levels of processing theory that we have already talked about emphasized encoding, what we do in putting stuff into memory, the encoding specificity principle acknowledges level of processing in its first part. That is, part one of that principle is basically looking at the value of encoding specificity as an input device. Part two, on the other hand, focuses on the information that is provided for retrieval, arguing that what is stored with the item determines what kind of retrieval cues will be most helpful. Okay? So essentially, part two argues in favor of that we hold learning conditions constant, that we can hold learning conditions constant as a prediction, and still demonstrate huge retrieval differences based on how retrieval is cued. We can keep the same learning conditions, condition A versus B, and yet if we alter the retrieval cue that is offered, we can show significant differences in the two different learning conditions or multiple learning conditions. And a cue that is effective in one place may not be effective at all under other kinds of conditions. So we've got to look at the cue that we store with the item as a basis for whether we're going to be able to retain that item or not. And the work that we summarized above on mood state dependency is clearly consistent with part two of the encoding specificity principle, as I was stating it for you there a minute ago. Now let's look not so much at the physical ones, which are fairly easy to talk about. Let's look at semantic cues and how those can vary. Okay? This was a study done by Thompson and Tulving in which they varied several different things. First of all, what they looked at was, well, I'm not quite sure what's happened here to my recall cue. Okay, somehow things have gotten messed up. But in essence, what we were dealing with there are items that you can see up at the top. That's a jump that really surprised me. In essence, what is supposed to happen is we have white on the same level as black, meat on the same level as steak, dumb on the same level as stupid, and so forth. Woman with man, ice with cold, and you can predict dark with light. Those, as recall cues, are very effective. If I give you a recall cue like white, that is very easy. That's a good cue for helping you recall black as a response term. Okay? Sorry that the visual messed up between storage at my office and display here. But then if we have other cues we can offer you, these are logically related, but these are not cues that you would immediately and instantly associate with the items on the right, which are what we are to store. Okay? Train, yes, can get black if it's filthy, particularly if it's a steam engine. Knife, yes, is tangentially related to steak, but not immediately. It's certainly not the same word class, type of word. Lamb is stupid in one version. Hand and man, yes, those do relate. Blow and cold, wind chill factors obviously are the mediator there, and head and light. That may be, in fact, a more obvious link than any of the others. But those on the left clearly are not as good as cues like white, meat, lamb, dumb, woman, hot, and head, dark, which cues you can even recall from memory because of the obvious tie there. So what they did was to take the items and then link them with a variety of different types of cues. And they studied, given which kind of cue the items were actually associated with, in a recall test, studying the good cues and then using the associated kind of cues to cue recall. What happens? Well, in the situation where we study recall after the improvement has, after studying the link between the good cues and the items. Boy, this thing is really messed up. That nose should be another line down. I'm going to have to go back and burp my computer, I think, here. But in essence, you can see what we're talking about, and that is basically you get improved recall as we look at each of the three columns of information to the right of the items. The worst recall, when you have been studying the relationship between the cues, white, meat, dumb, woman, ice, and dark, and the recall items, black, steak, stupid, and so forth. The recall is best in the situation where you use the same cues that are positively linked to recalling those items. Okay? If you study the to-be-remembered items, items like white are a good cue for recalling. No cue is actually better for cueing recall than is a weak cue. A not-so-good cue like train doesn't actually produce as good a memory or recall as does simply asking people to write down the items that you looked at. Okay? So in this situation, if we study good cues, we then find that good cues are the best ones to cue recall in this situation. Okay? Now, I don't know what's going to happen on this next one because it is really complex what I asked the computer to do here. But now what I'm going to do is to show you another condition. Well, it almost worked. In essence, what we've got here is recall after studying not so good cues, and the improving retention now alters. Now in this case, what we find is the not so good cue is actually the best recall item. That is, if you have studied the relationship between train and black, train then becomes the very best cue, not the most obvious one. And in that context then, a cue like white, which is normally the word that you most directly associate with black, isn't as effective in recalling, in cueing correct response in that situation. Meat, in the same way, related to steak, is not as good a cue as is knife when you have studied knife as the link. So in essence, despite the fact that we've demonstrated separately that words like white, meat, dumb, woman, ice, and dark are good cues, they don't turn out to be as good for cueing recall when the ones you have studied directly are what were previously demonstrated to be not so good cues. But having made that link, those suddenly become the best cues for cueing recall. And on that group, the items on the right, which have previously been studied with the recall terms on the left, now become the best examples. The ones that normally would be considered best are second best, and now in this situation, the absence of any cue at all produces the worst recall. So that in essence, what we've essentially demonstrated there is that in recall test, after studying the not so good cues and the associated items, recall is best for the former poor cues, intermediate for the good cues, and worst in the absence of any cues, with no cues. So that just as was predicted by the encoding specificity principle, what happens to items at encoding determines the cue's usefulness at the time of recall. Okay? How we study it determines to a certain extent the usefulness of the cues, and what's been demonstrated in that rather botched reproduction of the items by computer there is that the cues that have been studied in the context of the items essentially become the most effective cues for recall. And even in the situation where a normal ordering might be slightly different, that is, words that you would think would be best, suddenly if they haven't been studied in the context of the item, are not so good. Okay? So what we've demonstrated there is the importance of the specificity of the encoding that you use. And the items that have been encoded with the item at the time of learning are the items that are the most effective ones for recalling. Light and Carter-Sobel did another rather interesting study, at least I find it interesting, in which what they did was to show people items like this. The chop shop functioned smoothly. And again, remember, we're altering semantic cues here in comparison to what we'll see as phonemic cues here in a minute. I'm presenting a fairly complex series of data here, so you may want to go back and forth on the tape. But in essence, in this particular study, this was the starting point. Okay? You looked at studies like this, and then you were tested under one of three conditions later. The initial item studied was the chop shop functioned smoothly. Okay? So, in the test item, do we tend to use the same item, that is the same adjective, chop shop? Do we tend to use a different item, such as the Christmas shop functioned smoothly? Which is a possibility. You know, every year Galleria has at least one shop within it dedicated just to Christmas items, trees, and gifts, and trinkets for decorating the trees, and so forth. But that would be, you know, an obvious association to Christmas shop, and simply delete the adjective entirely. We may cue it by simply giving you this as the cue to recall the word chop. And what do we find? Well, in fact, in terms of recall percentage, it is best if we use the same adjective, okay? Recall is best if we cue it with the same sentence, the same type of sentence. It is intermediate if we do it without the absence of a cue, and it's actually worst, we get interference, if we end up using a cue that is semantically related, but a different adjective. Logically related to the sentence, but a completely different adjective. Okay? Maybe the different adjectives is consistent with different semantic meaning. That is, Christmas shop puts us in the mode or the thinking of Christmas shopping rather than a chop shop where cars are broken down to be sold for parts. If so, if that's true, that is, if we want to argue that a cue like Christmas shop basically puts us into a different semantic processing mode, thinking about Christmas shopping, then the use of a semantically similar adjective should usually lead to better recall. And in fact, when we tested, as was demonstrated there, it's best with the same average, it's intermediate with semantically similar adjectives, and it's worst with no adjective. So basically what we conclude is that even a weak cue can be strengthened by being associated during initial processing with the item that is later to be recalled. A cue that will get to the item not as successfully, but more successfully than no item at all, if it's weakly associated with it, is strengthened. Essentially, even a weak cue can be strengthened if it is there in the context of initial learning. And a cue that is based on original semantic encoding is better than one that changes the semantic encoding. Both of those are conclusions drawn out of the study that I cited there by Light and Carter-Sobel. Okay? Even a weak clue can be strengthened by being associated at the time of learning. And secondly, a cue based on original semantic encoding related to how you originally stored it away is going to be better than one that changes the context or the semantic encoding that is associated with that recall cue. So what's being demonstrated there is the power of a semantic link between the initial item and the recall situation later. Let's look at it another way. Let's look at phonemic differences and show you the same kind of comparison. In this particular study, participants are asked to respond yes or no to the question associated with sleet. Is this word associated with sleet? Okay? So that's going to be the key item. Okay? If you see hail, you're going to answer yes. Okay? In other words, if we have told you to respond in the context of the item you see is related to sleet, then if you're asked a question like, is the item related to hail, the answer is yes. We hear weather forecasts rarely, but sometimes here in Houston. Snow possible, sleet and hail likely. And sleet and hail tend to be very much related to each other. So semantically, phonemically, we've got a situation here where there is an obvious relationship. Let's show you how we can manipulate that, okay? After a series of such puzzles, you're going to be given then a variety of different types of retrieval cues in this situation. So that's the key question. Is the word associated with hail? Cues would be something like associated with sleet. Well, yes. That's a semantic linkage. We can use sleet and hail almost interchangeably, so there's a tight semantic linkage there, even though they don't sound at all alike. We could give you a clue like associated with snow. There is a remote linkage there between snow and sleet and hail, but the link to either of those other two from snow is much less direct than the link directly semantically between sleet and hail. And finally then, rhymes with bale gives us now a phonemic cue to the word sleet that we're actually looking for here. What do we find in terms of the data? If we give you a semantic link directly to hail, we find that recall is about 64% accurate. If we do it with a remote semantic cue and time enough to process it, there is no significant difference between the level of recall that you get in that situation and the one that you get if you use one that is strongly semantically related or linked. On the other hand, if we give you a phonemically related word, the linkage is much lower, 27%, suggesting then in this case that even a weak link can be strengthened by being associated with the initial learning when with the item that is to be recalled. Okay? Two conclusions drawn out of this study. Okay? Let me back up a little bit because I want to give you one other illustration of this. But in essence, what we're demonstrating with this particular element is essentially that the relative role and strength of semantic clues as opposed to phonemic cues. Let me now show it to you the other way. Same kind of situation, but now we're looking at this. Does the word rhyme with pale? Before I was giving you an example of the power of semantic linkages. Now we're going to do the same kind of thing, but use a phonemic linkage instead. So the cue that you're trying to respond in terms of now is, does the word rhyme with pale? And here we get a different kind of cue, okay? The cue in this case is rhymes with pale. Well, that's an obvious, very direct tie, phonemically, pale. Rhymes with bale. The link is remote, but it is still phonemically based. That is, bale and pale and bale don't directly relate to each other semantically, but obviously phonemically they sound very close to one another. Okay? And associated with sleet. Now we're giving you a semantic clue instead of a phonemic cue. And in these kind of testing situations, that is, this was repeated many times in the experiment, but the parallel I think you can see here, and the kind of results that we get are going to be best where there is phonemic identity or a very close link. We get second best recall when there's a remote phonemic link between the two. The rhyme is not perfect, but it's close. And we get the worst recall where the link is semantic rather than phonemic. Okay? So what I've done there in this experiment, that is in the two elements of this experiment, is to show you first a structure where we test different degrees of semantic, direct linkage or non-direct linkage, compared to phonemic, and then flip it, where we're looking at a direct phonemic linkage, an indirect phonemic linkage, and a semantic linkage. And in both cases, what you find essentially is an interaction between the encoding conditions and the accuracy of recall as a function of Q. That is, when we use semantic encoding, semantic cues are best. Okay, when we link in terms of meaning, we get the best recall when we give cues, however remotely related, are semantically tied to the element because we have trained originally using those semantic linkages. On the other hand, however, when phonemic encoding is being used, when we're training on the basis of memory or rhyming or something like that, then we find that phonemic cues are best. If we've trained in the context of phonemes, testing is best in the context of phoneme and is not so good in terms of semantically related cues. So we may choose only a limited number of cues to store at the time that we learn information in the initial learning. And other equally good cues that could be used may not be. That's a decision that we make. But the result is that as a function of however we learn the information at the beginning, they are not going to be as good if they're not deliberately folded into the learning that we use. So to back off this for just a minute, not deal with data, but deal with common sense here, there is a study that I always used to have some degree of difficulty explaining to myself, but it makes a lot of sense in the context of what we're dealing with here. And that is, we do know that if you're going to take an exam, you will do best on any exam in college if you study in the room where you're going to take the exam. Okay? So if we give two pieces of information, a 5-page essay, to one class in a room that is different from where everybody is going to be tested later, that class will not do as well when tested on that information, when tested in the same environment, as compared to a group that learned the same stuff, but was then tested in the same room where they originally learned it. Okay? That's a context effect, but it's making the same point that I made also at the beginning of the semester related to study cues and the study situation. You'll remember that we reviewed what your desk looks like, and the suggestion that I made was that you clear that desk off. You remove in wherever you normally study. First of all, you should study in the same place. Secondly, you should remove as many distractions as possible, and that includes both visual stuff like posters and letters and so forth and flowers, and also auditory stuff like a telephone, an alarm clock, and so forth and so on. Get that out of the way. The idea being that you want to replicate insofar as you can in the study situation, your desk, the kind of situation that you're going to be tested in the classroom. Now, yeah, there are some distractions in the classroom, but they certainly don't include typically a radio that is playing when you're studying. They don't include all the travel posters that you have spread in the room where you typically used to study. You've all changed that now. But essentially what we're showing you here is the data that shows you why those kind of cues. I told you at the beginning they were based on research. Here's the kind of research that those cues for improving your mastery of studied information is based. Now let's look then at essentially what are called transfer-appropriate procedures that can be used here. When we talk about transferable processing, what we're basically talking about here is learning materials with knowledge as to how it is going to be recalled later. We're essentially technically specifying exactly what I've just been talking about here. That is essentially what the strategy that's used in learning material can be relevant to the manner in which it is to be recalled later. How you learn it dictates to a certain extent your success in recalling it later. The Bauer demonstration was a very powerful demonstration of that. When you had the exact cues under which you had generated that material, you think about that. I mean, every time I think about that study, I'm stunned by it. Because in essence, when we did that, you had one time to write that down. You haven't thought about it in 2 days since. And yet you're 20 out of 20 in recalling it. Some of you are. And over half of you had 18 out of 20, 90% or better recall on material that you had reviewed one time. And the reason is that unlike when we normally sit there and simply memorize in serial the 20 lists in a row, you can do that, but it's less efficient than storing a cue by which to retrieve the information that you want. Go back and think about, again, the note that I suggested to you, the way in which you structure your page, where you have your, well, from your side, your notes on one side and the recall column on the left side. Essentially what you're doing is increasing the efficiency. You put the lecture notes here, and then in the left margin, get that right, yes, the left margin of your notes, I'm gesturing correctly for you, the left margin of your notes, you just put a word or two to cue recall of the broader information. All of this is very consistent with what we're talking about now. And the learning strategy, how you learn information, should include recognition of the conditions under which material to be learned is going to be recalled. Okay? That's the reason that people in plays, acting, study, rehearse the play in the context of the environment. It's one thing to look at the script. It's another thing to move correctly and intone it correctly when you're actually interacting face-to-face on stage with a fellow actor. And so basically, what this leads to is a question like, do you actually study the same for essay tests that you do for multiple choice tests? And the answer should be no, because you're going to be recalling a different type of information and with a different target when you're doing a multiple choice test than you are when you're doing an essay test, which leads in turn to two different types of learning that we can talk about. Fact-oriented learning is essentially learning that is not stressing applications of the learned materials. That is, in that case, with fact-oriented learning, multiple choice, you're simply being asked to recall the information itself. You prep differently for that than you do for problem-oriented learning, where the emphasis there is going to be on application. If you're studying for an essay exam, essentially what you're doing is prepping yourself for problem solving. You don't know what the instructor is going to ask you, but it is clear that he or she is going to come in with something like, describe for me the three primary economic factors leading to the Civil War in the United States of America, 1860 to 1865. They've given you no help at all in retrieving that information, but it is clearly posed to you as a problem. As you think back to all the different things you've learned and the relationships between them in that history course, prepping in that way with the idea of problem solving using the information is going to be very different than if you're simply taking a 50-item multiple choice test on that same information. So in essence, the evidence does support the wisdom of this distinction between fact-oriented as opposed to problem-oriented learning. Now I want to take a big intellectual leap here and look at this in a very different way. So far we've been talking only about memory strategies and the recall strategies that we use in a given situation, the learning strategies and the recall situations that we use. But let's look at it in one other way. Tulving wrote a very interesting paper back in the mid-80s that looks essentially at drawing a parallel between the three different types of memory that he proposed. Can you do those from memory? Episodic, semantic, and procedural. Well, he tried to draw a parallel between those and three different ways of understanding, three different levels of what he called basically consciousness. You could think of that essentially as awareness if you want. One of the types of awareness that he talked about is essentially defined simply as self-knowing consciousness. This is an awareness of you yourself. You know the kind of situation under which you study best. Some of us work better under time pressure. Well, okay, then maybe that means you cut it a little closer to the end before you produce or try to learn whatever it is you have to learn. On the other hand, others of us are much better if we're organized, OCD type, organized early, study 5 minutes a day for a month before an exam rather than 3 hours intensely just prior to it. Well, part of that is coming out of what Tulving is arguing here is that part of that is coming out of what he is labeling autonoetic consciousness. That is, you're aware of your own limits and preferences in terms of learning strategy. The second type of consciousness that he talks about is what's called noetic consciousness. This is essentially a knowing consciousness that features basically an awareness of objects and events, the paraphernalia around us essentially, and how they relate to one another. Even in the absence of the objects and events themselves, you still have a symbolic representation of them. That is, if you think about your car right now, that is something that is clearly not here in studio with us, but you have a representation of that symbolically. You could pick it out of 100 cars in the lot, aided by your hoped-for memory of where you parked in the massive 4 square block parking lots here at the U of H. Every now and then you will see people a little sheepishly riding around in the police car looking for their car, because basically they've forgotten where on earth at 7 in the morning they put it. And the context is very important to locating your car. Yeah, you'll recognize it, but you may not be looking for it in the right area. That essentially is a feature of noetic consciousness, as Tulving is talking about it here. And the third type of consciousness is what he calls anoetic. That is essentially non-knowing consciousness. This is basically bound to the here and now. It's kind of your awareness of what's going on immediately. It emphasizes the current environment, and it basically monitors ongoing behavior. That is where you're processing whether you're going to be able to make it till the end of the lecture before going to the restroom. Okay, that is a function of anoetic consciousness. You're basically just processing you as an operating system at any given time. Are you hungry at this point? Are you likely to keel over unconscious because you forgot to eat supper last night, breakfast this morning, and so forth? And so basically, this issue of consciousness raises to me what is a fascinating issue in the study of memory, and that is basically awareness. Are you and I aware when we are learning or not? And that in turn puts us into the consideration of another very important type of distinction among different types of both recall of information and memory itself. And that is the difference between implicit as opposed to explicit memory. We know, for instance, I'm going to talk here now about what is called anterograde amnesia. And it is generally asserted that patients that are suffering from anterograde amnesia lose the ability to form long-term memories of events that happen after their injury. Okay? So in the instance of anterograde amnesia, what happens there is the loss of ability to form long-term memories for events happening after an injury. Injury, any events afterwards, are difficult to retain in long-term memory. Such people theoretically and actually tend to very much live in the present, I mean. So if you go in and meet somebody who is a suffering true and serious anterograde amnesia, typically you will have to reintroduce yourself if you've been away overnight. Okay? They just do not know you. They do not remember you because you're not stored in long-term memory if you didn't meet them until after their injury was encountered. Interestingly enough, even that kind of assertion that anterograde amnesia eliminates the ability to form long-term memories can be counter-argued in the following way. Okay? We show people a list of words that includes a series of 8-letter words like this one. And then we test them. Give them an hour of work with 8 or 10 words like this, and then test them. Recall is miserable. And yet, we bring them back into the lab later, the next day, something like that, in a different situation, testing them in a different or unrelated form, and we pose to them an anagram like this, which has 4 out of the 8 letters of the words that they originally learned, and ask them to recall it. Do you know what word is involved there? Let's see if you remember the word. We haven't actually studied it, but the correct answer in that case is assassin. Okay? I can even tease you with a shorter one that you may get or not. Oh, double-clicked. Sorry about that. Let me back up one. Well, I guess I'm not going to. I'm not going to be able to do it for you. But in essence, pose that to a friend, blank L, blank B, blank M, blank, and see whether they can in fact recall Alabama as an example. The only difference there is, of course, it's a kind of poor illustration of an important point, and that is, under these conditions, people who have not previously seen those, as you haven't, although you're not suffering anterograde amnesia, will not do as well as people who, with anterograde amnesia, having studied them previously, 24 hours later, can do markedly better, can do significantly better in that kind of a recall task. So taking the knowledge that they have been exposed to, but not been able to demonstrate their ability to perform it, and then test them later in a different situation under a slightly different testing condition, bingo, the knowledge is there. So we've got a kind of a complex issue here when we really start talking about long-term memory. May or may not be an all or none situation, because we just, in your situation earlier, provided an example of where all of you but one had recalled less than half of the 20 items that I read to you in the previous tape, and yet over half of you got all of them or 90% of them correct 24 hours later. So it isn't just as simple as it's there or it's not there. The recall cues can be important. The conditions of recall can be important. So in essence then, let's talk about specifically implicit memory. We define it essentially as the retention of information leading to improved task performance, not requiring conscious learning or intentional remembering. It's incidental. It is essentially also labeled as unintentional learning, okay? It's incidental learning, also called unintentional learning. That is what is stored in implicit memory, okay? It may involve remembering something like the color of the pants that your husband or boyfriend was wearing yesterday. Or when you go Christmas shopping, trying to remember the color that they normally wear and getting a complimentary accessory, a handkerchief, a tie, a belt, whatever. That is drawing out of implicit memory unless you specifically remembered the previous day to focus on the color that they were wearing. Okay? So implicit memory is something that you didn't deliberately learn, and yet when you reach for it, it's there. You are able to actually recall it. Okay? I ask you now, who did you eat breakfast with this morning? You may not have actively sat there and rehearsed it, but you remember. You may remember whether the food was warm or cold. You didn't actively rehearse it, though you may have commented on it at the time. But as I ask you about that now, you can remember what you ate, and that is a feature that was ancillary to the fact that it was scrambled eggs. But did they look attractive when you ate them? Were they well cooked? And so forth and so on. This kind of memory, implicit memory, is basically unconscious. It's going on, it's operating. That kind of information is taken in. But it's accessible only indirectly. That is, you're not consciously aware of it, but yet if we ask you about it later, you can retrieve it if you need to. And it's best detected and detected and measured using something like relearning or savings measures that are unaffected by things like amnesia. They tend to be unaffected by age, by many different drugs that will otherwise impact explicit memory, by even the length of the retention interval for true implicit memory, and even the effects of interference. Interference does not tend to impact implicit memory. So it's largely unconscious, but it involves the kind of, boy, I can't think of a good example here right now, but think back to the day you graduated from high school. Was it indoors or outdoors? Which you may not have ever actively described for somebody. If it was outdoors, was it sunny, cloudy, or raining during the ceremony? That would be an example of implicit memory. It's something that you may not have even commented on at the time. Or was it, say, cloudy or partly cloudy? That you're even less likely to have talked about. But if you think about it a minute, you could probably retrieve that information from your high school graduation. And that's an example then of implicit memory. You've never actively rehearsed it, but it's there if you need it. And then secondly, distinguished from that, we can also label what is called explicit memory. In explicit memory, what we're dealing with is intentional recollection of previously learned information, let me try that again. Intentional recollection of previous learning or experiences. That's what I was trying to say, okay? I knew in my explicit enunciation that I was not correct in what I was saying there. The features of explicit memory are, first of all, that it's conscious. I can ask you whether you know somebody, and you can tell me yes or no. Although for me, I'm so poor on names, the answer may be, I think I do. It's accessed directly, okay? You don't have to mess around. You can reach in directly and know whether you know the combination to your locker or a combination lock or something like that. It's best tested using recall or recognition, not the indirect or recognition-based memories so much as the direct recall-based memories. And it's definitely affected by things like amnesia. When somebody suffers that, a lot of your memory of functionally all of your memory of the specific events of some portion of your life just evaporates, is inaccessible. It's also impacted by age. You may or may not be aware of the fact that when you and I communicate with each other, except in a learning environment or a science or art-rich environment such as a university, in our everyday face-to-face communications, we tend to use a very limited pool of words. Okay? Thorndike and Lorge, way back in the 1940s, actually did a count of words in terms of how often they're used, and what others were able to demonstrate is that the vocabulary that you and I use is only about 2,000 to 3,000 words in most of our face-to-face interactions. When you greet somebody, almost without exception, it's hi, hello, or how are you, or some very limited pool of events. And in fact, we process so little in that situation, what we tend to do is to simply say back to somebody whatever they've said to us, as I've suggested to you earlier. But in essence, the pool that we use is also, I suspect, I've never seen data on this, but I'll bet you that pool is even more severely limited with age. One of the reasons the bloom is off the rose in marriages is that it becomes repetitive, it becomes redundant. After a while, I mean, one of the excitements of a new relationship is that you get, you never know what's going to happen, what word is going to be used, how the conversation is going to start, what turn it's going to take. And that gradually gets reduced down to the basics, the redundancy of everyday life. So those are essentially effects of age on the processing of explicit memory. Many drugs will impact, and if they're memory related, will reduce explicit memory more so than implicit memory. The length of the retention interval can be foreshortened or is a factor in how much you will be able to recall from your explicit retentions. And the effects of interference are much greater, as we're going to show in the next lecture. Some would argue that the distinctions between implicit and explicit memory occur because they're based on different cognitive processes, which is interesting. We could do a whole seminar on that. Others argue that the distinction between implicit and explicit memory occur because they're based on independent systems of memory, that there are systemic differences that we're talking about in a given situation. Now, in essence, I'm going to pick up with a demonstration at this point in the next lecture. So we will start looking next at a particular element of implicit, explicit memory.